Hi all, welcome to the Indivisidisability video on getting and winning at insurance coverage. Now this isn't to say that everybody's going to win in all circumstances, and this isn't going to say that all insurances are created equally, because they certainly are not, as anyone who lives in the United States definitely knows. Of course, I don't want this video to only apply to the United States, because I do not think that it does. However, some of what I'm going to talk about will be uniquely attributable to the United States. Some of the things, though, may help you even if you're living in other countries. I hope that they do, and I would love to get feedback on that, because I think it's important that we're as inclusive as possible. And there's certainly going to be some things that are harder and more difficult here. There are certainly going to be aspects of this that are going to be so difficult that they may not make it worth it to fight. So that's part of what I want to talk about in this first part of the video, is what are some of the barriers, what are some of the myths possibly about insurances, and debunking some of those things. What things are true about insurance companies, and then helping people decide from that information whether this is a fight in which you want to engage. And so that's what this first video is going to be about. In later videos then, we're going to talk about how to go about that fight if you decide that you're the person who is a good candidate for this. So the first myth that I want to talk about is this idea that insurance never covers this. Now, particularly, this video has been mostly requested in my regenerative medicine research group, but a lot of the techniques that I've used to get many different things covered. I've used these techniques to get drugs covered that I've needed for prescription drug plans. I've used some of these techniques to get things like Synvisc, which is actually a pharmaceutical drug injection, covered. I've used it then, of course, for regenerative medicine. And here is one thing that's absolutely true. If you never challenge your insurance formulary, it will never cover it. That is absolutely true. If we never challenge our insurance, if we never challenge the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, or the drug companies, these things are never going to get covered. And really, if I wanted to get really holistic about this, I would say one of the things that we need to do as a group is to start challenging, to start calling our legislators, to start telling them how badly we need reform, with drug companies running the FDA, with the FDA only approving drugs that, and looking at research that drug companies are doing, and widely ignoring research that is being done not for profit at public universities that tends to have a lot less bias in it because they're not being paid to do this research. So we really need to start looking at how things are done, especially in the United States, and how to change that. I'll step off of my soapbox though and get back to this. So that idea that insurance never covers this, when you hear that from a doctor, when you hear that from someone, what I'd like people to repeat in their heads and to really realize is that that's correct. They will never cover it as long as we continue to lie down and let them not cover it. If we don't challenge them, they won't. So starting from that premise, there are some things that are going to be nearly impossible to get covered. That is true. But I do want to say that most of the things I'm going to be talking about today, it is not impossible for several of them to get covered. Some are less likely, but some I have seen covered increasingly in many places, and not just where I live, and not just for me. So I'd like to debunk that right off the bat. So one thing to keep in mind for all of this is that there are different types of insurance, and they are not all created equally. So when we're talking about the United States, is very different from a lot of other Western countries. Other Western countries, almost all of them have guaranteed socialized health insurance of one form or another. It doesn't mean that every type of service is covered. It doesn't mean that just because you have public insurance that a person can go out and get something like prolotherapy or platelet-rich plasma or a stem cell. But in a lot of those countries, there is still an appeals process. And I think that's where this video could still apply and may still help people. So I want to start from that idea too, that I don't think this has to only apply to the United States. But aside from socialized medicine, there's insurance that's fully private and fully funded, and that is either employer-driven or consumer-driven, and that's where the consumer picks and chooses and pays for what they want covered. And if that's the case, often there's a board or a panel or somebody who decides whether something's going to be covered or not. And those are usually the easiest places to get things that aren't traditionally on a formulary covered. And they're the easiest places to make a case for things that tend to be cheaper than certain other things. So for example, prolotherapy is much cheaper than surgery for tennis elbow. So it's usually pretty easy to argue to a board at a private insurance company that that's cheaper, and it's a little bit easier to get it covered. Now, HMOs are maybe a different level of things. They're still not impossible. They have different levels of administration, and if you end up at the right level and talking to the right person, particularly on the right day, they again are not impossible for things to get covered. There are public insurances that we have here in the United States, and one option is actually one that I'm working with currently here in Wisconsin. And some public insurances have options for appeals. And they do have their formularies, and they can be very challenging because they tend to deny everything outright that's not on their formulary. And it can get exhausting, and people can run out of energy because usually to be on these insurances, one has to have a disability to begin with. So it tends to mean that you don't have a lot of energy to expend anyway. And it means that when you're already appealing 10 other things that you should be getting just to survive to begin with, other things may seem like luxuries to you. But when there is an option to appeal, and if you can get into a place where you have things stabilized and you can get the right kind of help, there are sometimes those options. And so that's something to keep in mind. And then the last, when it comes to the United States and in a couple of countries, they're fully public socialized programs. Like here we have Medicare and Medicaid in the US, and they don't have options to appeal. And that's important to know because they can be extremely rigid and really difficult to deal with, and it can be very frustrating. And as of right now, that's how it works. And that's where I say, really write your representatives and talk to them about this and talk about how important this is, because more and more we're finding that people are having different kinds of issues. They don't fit in within a little box, and people still need help, and it might not fall into a particular formulary. It might not fall into what the FDA has decided is not experimental anymore, and those people still need help. I would say that last segment of a fully public option that's 100% Food and Drug Administration controlled, that's where you're going to have the steepest uphill battle. You're going to need a senator basically in your pocket to be able to win. I definitely would not recommend going on that fight alone. So now that we've talked about the different types of insurance, knowing that those are kind of like from the easiest to the most difficult to get an appeal through, knowing what the types of procedures are and the likelihood of coverage. So the idea is that the closer the procedure is to being, I guess, socially accepted, FDA approved, the more likely it's going to be that a person is going to win. So just a few examples of that. So a few things that I've gotten approved, for example, Synvisc is a drug that was approved for the knee a long time ago. Shortly after that, in Europe, they started allowing people to have it done in other joints, but in the US, they were very strict that it was knees only, knees only. I was able to fight my insurance to get it done in my ankle, and it helped in my ankle. And then once I had it done once, I was able to re-up and get it done again. And so that was something where it had already been approved, and then this was an off-label use, and it was something that I was able to get done. Prolotherapy is another one of those things where we have no idea how long it's going to be before it's FDA approved, but there's really strong evidence for certain types of conditions, such as tennis elbow, knee osteoarthritis, conditions like that, that it is extremely effective. And so because of that established research, it gets pretty difficult when the alternative for the person is something like a surgery. For an insurance company to say, oh, well, we're not going to pay a couple $100s for these injections, and we're going to get a knee replacement instead. So those are the kinds of things, and we're going to talk about that in another video when we talk about how to win. You're going to want to keep the idea of leverage in your mind. You're going to hear that again, leverage. Remember that. Platelet-rich plasma is something with a lot of burgeoning evidence that's coming out, and there's a ton of research on that. Not as much as prolotherapy. It's newer than prolotherapy by quite a lot, and so that one's a little bit more difficult. And then of course there is stem cell therapy, which is even newer than that and can be a little bit more controversial because there's so many different types of stem cell therapy, and people hear it and they think about embryonic stem cells. There's a lot of controversy around that, and so even when people are using their own mesenchymal stem cells and things like that, there's just a lot of connotation in that sometimes can put hitches in the place of things like stem cells. But with all of these things, it doesn't mean that any of them are impossible, but it's just that the more, I guess, controversial they are, the more difficult you may find that it is for them to get approved. And so if you're going for something that's pretty straightforward, like a Synvisc or a prolotherapy or something like that, it's probably going to be something that you're going to be more likely to win. So it might be something worth taking your time. If it's something like a new experimental stem cell procedure, no matter how badly you need it, it's a lot more expensive. There's a bunch of things going against it. That is going to take a lot more of your time, so that's just something to factor in. How much harder and how much more uphill that battle will be. So take that into consideration. This is not to tell you what to do, what not to do, but just to take that into consideration. And so that being said, this is where you have to calculate your own personal cost-benefit ratio. How much does the procedure cost for you to have it done? How much time, energy, and effort is it going to cost you personally to put in, and how much of that do you have to give right now? So I really tell people, take that into consideration. How much time do you have? How much money are you going to save over the long haul if you fight this battle and you win it now? Now keep in mind, the first battle is the hardest battle to win, always. It's uphill, they fight the most, they may even make you go to the national level to win it. But oftentimes, if you can win one time, the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth time, it's easier. And it's not just easier because you've done it before, it's easier because once an insurance company has approved something once, they tend to approve it again, especially if you can demonstrate that it's working and it's helping you and it's doing something effective like staving off a surgery. So what you have to decide is, just as an example, there have been people in our groups who have shown up and they have a slight injury to their knee and they want it to get better faster, and they really only need 1 or 2 procedures to their knee, which might cost, you know, a maximum of maybe $500 or $600 to get a couple of procedures done, or might even be cheaper if they're getting it done like a prolozone or some cheaper procedure. For them to spend what would be the equivalent of probably an entire couple of work weeks of their time and the equivalent of a doctor's work week of their time to get this approved, the amount of time that it's going to cost in those doctor's work hours, in your own personal work hours, to get a few $100s worth of procedures probably isn't going to be worth it, especially if you're still pretty healthy and in working order. For me personally, what ended up being worth it for me was that I was already so ill that I was on disability. I couldn't work. And so I wasn't missing work to put time into this. And because I was missing work, I didn't have money to pay for any of these procedures. And so I wasn't losing income by taking time off to do these appeals. I was already kind of at rock bottom in terms of income, at rock bottom in terms of the amount of time that I was taking off. And so for me, all I had was time, and all I didn't have was money. And nothing was going to change unless I got these procedures done. So for me, it was a simple choice. Most people aren't quite at that place yet. And for you, what you need to decide is, how close are you to that place? Will it be worth it to take that time and invest that time? Are you the kind of person who has a condition like, in my case, I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and hypermobility throughout my body, so winning one set of procedures, like for example on my rib cage, was huge because I needed my whole rib cage done. And then as I've needed my shoulders and I've needed my knees and my hips and my ankles and wrists and all of these other joints done, it's been a really big deal to have invested that time. And then, like I said, conversely, if you're somebody who's probably just got the one injury, that investment, you know, it's something that's really a personal decision that you are going to have to make. If you're a person who has a lot of money and a lot of earning potential, at that point in time, taking the time off may not make sense for you. And again, that's just a decision that you'll have to make. So once you've done that, that can really help you decide, am I a good candidate for fighting the good fight? So once you've made that decision, you can begin the next step, which is coming up in the next video.